Fair taxes in the classroom. There is a really huge political discussion going about the world now about fair taxes, about what does it mean to pay fair taxes. And it's a tricky one because where I come from in America, um, it's been very clear that the wealthy elite have been able to use media through lobbying and ownership and to gain greater ownership in media, and also lobbying in the political sphere to enable tax laws that favor the wealthy over and above the needs of the working people. And that I include the working poor and middle class people. And so I raised this issue about what is fair taxes in a classroom recently, and the responses, remember these are 18, 19-year-olds, the responses were from the meritocracy debate, you know, you earned it, you should be able to keep it, and everyone should pay the same amount, to, of course, naturally, if you earn over, $100 million, then you should pay more in taxes. And there is because they also have the innate feeling that some of the wealth is gained through the public resources, which are paid for through taxes. And one of the things I saw in this debate was a very typical conservative libertarian divide that you will see in knee-jerk responses to many sorts of issues. There's been a lot of research on differences between the conservative and liberal brain. And so you have people who respond to something that for these students is quite uncertain because they don't really know the details of any tax system anywhere, let alone here where we are. So it's uncertainty for them. So they were really going on their emotive feelings, their surroundings, the people around them. And I suspect for many of them, they don't have a lot of cross-class access to see on the level, an intimate level, to know how differently taxes are paid. Now, this is a class where we have gone through many ethical case studies of business taking advantage of society, exploiting people, resources. And so on one hand, they know that there are ways that corporations externalize and put those costs to society, upon the public coffers. But even still, when you are confronted with such a direct question, should we have progressive taxes? Should we really root out tax havens? What should we do to combat tax dodging and that sort of thing? It almost feels like they don't connect the dots between the rhetoric on one hand of corporate mafians versus their idea, like a basic idea of fairness. And so it's as extreme as even The Economist, and I share this with my students quite a bit, is discussing now the rise of the millennial socialism. And at the heart of it, they're also managed, to raise the issue of what's different now about the rise of the so-called socialism versus when it happened reasonably in the 90s, and the middle way, as they just was presented by Clintonianism in America. Well, here's the deal. And I think this is what's different, and this is where I'd like to lead this discussion to, is what is different now. So I was the dominant youth group back in the 90s. I was one of those, young voters who was seeing inequality around me and understanding what Warren Buffett has come to say, that he is one of the wealthiest people in America, pays less taxes than his secretary. And so them pledging philanthropically to give their money to public coffers or public goods and other ways, perhaps through charity, as part of their inheritance is laudable, quite laudable, and they're leading a way. However, there's something even bigger here when it comes to leveling the playing field. Many of my students, when I say they have not been exposed to cross-class ways of living, would not have been exposed to what elitism does in our society and what the expansion of inequality has done over just the decades since the 90s. What's also changed since the 90s is social media. It's not so easy for the conservatives to say, wait a minute, that's communism, and raise that red flag. because we now have social media to challenge the network television and network news. There are alternatives. In fact, what happens in social media is often what gets reported on in the news. So the nature of the conversation has changed. Because remember, when I say that I was a kid in the 90s, I didn't necessarily understand, I was only beginning to understand socialism beyond the black white terms that we often present in earlier in primary education. You know, um, there's capitalism over here and there's communism over there. There's democracy over here, and across that wall there is again communism. You know, we didn't really question the links between capitalism and democracy, even though this was, again, by the 90s, we had grown through a period of the 80s of deregulation. So we had seen what privatization was doing to our world and how inequality and homelessness were expanding, and how much more of dealing with the ramifications of this had been put also into charitable hands rather than, again, looked at as a public responsibility. So there was no corporate accountability in those days. And so by the 90s, when we were ready to charge this, we had cable, 24-hour cable news, but we didn't have the feedback mechanism that the public can bring to that magnitude of propaganda about what socialism is and how socialism is anti-democratic. Because remember, they don't say that there is any unnatural link between capitalism and democracy, and the dominant ideology, those two are inextricably linked. But now what millennials are able to articulate, because we're able to nuance the conversation much more and elect someone like AOC, so Bernie Sanders doesn't have to be the only democratic socialist representing, people can have those nuanced discussions that we couldn't have before. And so I'm really, really excited about what it means, even as clearly as you will see all issues related to taxes come to fore. So you will see, of course, Warren Buffett again come out with statements along with Bill Gates and Facebook, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, about what these super wealthy, and they're going to be challenging Jeff Bezos to say, well, what are you going to actually do for society with this wealth? That's one thing. The second thing is, I do believe that because we actually have more so-called socialist leaders in politics, like AOC in America now, like what's happening in France and in many other parts of the world, that the rich are called to account to say, what are you giving back to society, given that you've gained workers, you've gained from our infrastructure, you've gained from our schools, you've gained from everything that our society produces in order for you to be wealthy. How are you going to contribute in a fair way? And for many people, they understand that this means that there will have to be higher tax rates for people. In America, even Elizabeth Warren has proposed a higher tax rate for people who earn over 50 million, and another one for people who earn over 100 million. So these kinds of ideas, I think, will be able to flourish through social media in a way that they could not have in the cable era, and certainly didn't in the network era prior to that, when again, advertising dollars controlled the message, controlled who was on screen, who was on radio, who was printed in the newspaper, and how they were portrayed. That era is being challenged and destabilized by social media, exemplified by the Occupy movement. Like, this is Occupy 2.0. This is Occupy 2.0. Like, it didn't end. It's still happening. People want to know, what about the 99%? Thank you. Send in your thoughts. Send in your love too.